A very warm welcome. Tonight you're joining us here at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24 with a very special guest, somebody who we can call as the person who not only oversees economic development, runs the economy, sees the changes, makes the amendments and runs the show. Let me warmly welcome Dr. P.B. Jayasundera, Secretary to the President. Ivan. Very happy to have you here at Hyde Park.
Very happy to be with you here.
Certainly. So, so many changes happening. But before that, I wanted to ask you, how does it feel to be the Secretary to the President? You've been Finance Secretary, and that too during a time when the President held the finance portfolio. So, effectively, Secretary to the President, so many years, over a decade there too. You served under many Prime Ministers, many Presidents, and here you are.
Yes, I feel honored to serve the present President as his Secretary. I was invited to serve him, and I thought it's my duty when the whole nation gave a mandate to him to change the country, and he invited everybody, and I was one of them.
You started as Finance Secretary under the government of former President Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumartunga back in 1999, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. But you were involved with the central bank. You've gone through the mill. You've come up through managing economic matters, regulations for the country.
Yes, I have a long career in public service, both in the central bank and also in the Ministry of Finance and also in the Ministry of Economic Development. I was Secretary there also for 4 years while I was Secretary Treasury. I actually never thought I will join the Ministry of Finance because my career path was in the central bank. Because I was, after my studies, I thought I should be in the central bank. But then during President Premadasa's time, I was invited to be the economic advisor. So I joined the Treasury on a part-time basis. Then during Minister Vijay, he was the minister, and he had a short time also for as president. That time also I was there. Then the transition took place. President Chandrika Kumartunga became Minister of Finance. I was asked to stay.
Yes.
So I stayed. I had excellent working experience with her. I served after, I think, 2 years or 3 years, I was appointed as Deputy Secretary to the Treasury.
Right.
1 year after I was appointed as Secretary of Finance. I was simultaneously asked to take charge of the Public Enterprise Reform Commission.
Right.
So I enjoyed working with her, and then there was a change in government. I discontinued as Secretary of Finance, but Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe asked me to stay in the Public Enterprise Reform Commission. I was there for a year. After that I quit. And then President Kumartunga became again the chief of the government, and I was invited to be the Secretary of Finance. Minister Amunugama was the Minister of Finance, so I had a very productive period during that time. And then 2005, November, I think, Mahinda Rajapaksa became the President. And I was asked to continue. So I continued with him for 10 years. And I was assisting him in managing the country, economy. And again, very productive time.
They say you ran the economy then, is that true?
I ran the economy as a Treasury Secretary. I did my share of responsibility. But Minister of Finance is there, Prime Minister is there. So if somebody is telling me that I ran the economy, I'm honored because that is the job of the Treasury Secretary. And then government change again. So I ceased to be the Secretary of Finance. By that time I had well over 40 years of public service.
Yes.
I thought it's a time also to retire. I went back to the village. I had a nice time. I'm still living in the village. 5 years. Then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa got elected. He called me and said, be my secretary. I couldn't refuse because when the whole nation is asking him to do something, no citizen has right to refuse his request. So I honored that. And I came there. So it's a destiny. So I'm truly honored because it's a unique difference. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa is different from all presidents. He is first ever technocrat turned leader in this country. He was also a secretary in the President Rajapaksa's government when I was Secretary of Finance. So I have seen him as a technocrat, not as a president or my boss. But now it is over 1 year, little over 1 year. And it's amazing experience.
Wonderful, and I think when you talk about tech-based development, that's something I'd like to explore during our discussion and speak further. But it seems like all the presidents of the country, most of them, they want to work with you. They've enjoyed working with you. They've wanted you in office. But of course, you have endured public scrutiny, legal issues, political changes throughout your career, and also we've seen, you speak about President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's time as president. Since January, this country faces a global pandemic, not just the challenges that the country faces, but again, economic issues. At times you're blamed for the downfall of the economy. At times there have been remarkable achievements we've made. But how have you navigated through all that?
No economy just have one steady path, except countries where the governments have full control over public, like South Korea at that time, or Singapore, one-party system, democracy, China. Those places probably you have one steady 20, 30, 40 governments. And they have different systems. But in countries like Sri Lanka, India, are democracies where the constitution permits any government to have 5 to 6 year term. Within 5 to 6 year term also political changes can take place. So it is in a democratic environment. Public officials also have to work, and fortunately or unfortunately, I happen to had very high-profile jobs where political leaders have the choice to decide who should be in their secretaries. And I never had any problem in working both sides of the government. But secretary to the treasury post is a position that the government handpicks. So that is how this happens even here or elsewhere. And Sri Lanka has gone through difficult times, not only when I was Secretary Treasury. Several of my former colleagues had the same cycles. Some are global business cycles, some are climate cycles, some are political cycles, and so on and so forth. And good time, bad time. I have managed my responsibilities to the best of my abilities, and I feel I have done my job well.
I think that's something I want to question you about, your job so far during your tenure, not just as Secretary to the President, but as Finance Secretary during the government of then President Mahinda Rajapaksa. But to begin with, budget. That's something I would like to talk about. Budget 2021, still very questionable among not just the opposition. Sometimes even the people might say, what really did the government give us? Because traditionally, we're used to seeing handouts, instant benefits for pensioners, the public servants, and just the people too. But this time around the budget, we did see that there was a certain a U-turn maybe, or a different turn that was taken in terms of how the budget was written, what we gave out of the budget. Are you behind this?
I was requested by President and Prime Minister both to assist the Treasury Secretary and the officials to prepare the budget. Because President himself is heavily involved in managing the country, managing the economy, managing the national security, because as the head of the state, it is his responsibility, because he is elected president. He was elected on the premise that what he promised to the country is delivered. He presented before the people what is called Saubhagya Dakma. It was not just an election manifesto. People know in this country, since President Gotabaya Rajapaksa left in 2015, January 8th, he engaged heavily with the professionals in this country. He mobilized all types of educated people. He constantly developed various issues. He looked at not just as a retired public servant, but he looked at how can Sri Lanka do something different. So that's the consultation process. He did not stop talking only to the professionals. Under Vietmaga arrangement, I was in my village. Actually, I was having a retirement life where as President Rajapaksa was looking at various alternative options, how Sri Lanka could be changed. And then he also visited villages, spoke to people. He's not a person who spent a lot of time with political representatives or public rallies, but he directly, when he meets somebody, he talks and asks, okay, what's your problem? Why are you doing like this? Why can't you do something better? What are your options? That kind of a personality. And through that, he got elected, and then he presented that Saubhagya Dakma as a national policy of Sri Lanka, and the government adopted from day one. That's why I'm telling it's a unique opportunity for me to see how he's working. And he started translating into action. Whatever the circumstances in the country, he just began the transformation process which he anticipated in Saubhagya Dakma. So budget is not something different from that vision. And he formed ministries to the best of his abilities. He guided the formation of cabinet. I mean, not only people should think the budget is different, his gazette notification is different regarding the formation of government. It was a re-engineering of government, because people in this country were looking for scientific classification of ministries. Some people were even recommending, some people who have never worked in government telling, why not you have this type of ministries, why don't you cluster these subjects and all. But within the political realities, he clustered each ministry within the subject areas, and then he appointed ministers, defined the scope of work, defined the critical priorities, and gave the mandate to each of these ministers, secretaries, officials, and then he started meeting them. It is again different from Vietmaga type of consultation, because now he is talking with the people, with the political leadership in ministries, officials, how to translate, because now it is the responsibility of the government machinery how to get this going. And I must say, we had so much exhaustive discussions, dialogue meetings, private sector, public sector, media, everybody, many people send proposals, and it is those ideas that became the national budget. So it is not single-minded budget. So if it is different, that is a reflection of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's new approach to Sri Lanka.
Right. Allow me to go in for a short commercial break, Secretary. We'll return at Hyde Park in conversation with Secretary to the President, Dr. P.B. Jayasundera. Welcome back at Hyde Park. We're in conversation with the Secretary to the President, Dr. P.B. Jayasundera. We're still talking about Budget 2021. Now, the opposition says, of course, again, talking about the opposition to the budget, that there, like I said, nothing much has happened, yet the government has effectively found ways to prune its own revenue mechanisms, revenue avenues, and also that there is no new revenue generation methods that have been found through this budget, plus the fact that there is nothing for 2021. This is only an approval that the government sought for measures that the president promised when he came to power in 2020. So basically giving validation to his promises and policies of 2020.
Yeah, I do not want to respond to opposition's allegations or government praising it. But I want to spend a little bit time on what really has happened in 2020. That is President's full first 1 year. Lot has happened. Lot has happened because he inherited a declining growth. If one take a 5-year period, 5-year period, because this country has seen growth rate fluctuating in different years, but nobody has seen one clear downward direction for a period of 5 years. Not even during war, not even during the trouble period in 87, 88, because you just see a disturbance and economy bounce back. Here there has been a period from 2015 to 2019, solid 5-year period. Every year growth rate was declining. It was not only declining, it declined from 5.5% in 2015 to 2.3% by 2019. And though President Rajapaksa took over government, trend was that. Trend spilling to 2020 as well. Trend was spilling to 2020 as well. So it's a country with a hemorrhage. That's the general trend. There has been huge sums of arrears payments. Fertilizer bills had not been paid. You can just talk to fertilizer companies in the country, government as well as private, and ask from them, not from me, not from President Rajapaksa or anybody. They have been not paid. They have, technically speaking, it's a default. Local payments have been not paid for 2-3 years. Sums were over 250 billion. Construction industry has virtually come to a halt because construction contractors, whether they are small, medium or large, they had their claims in hands, but payments have not been made. Pharmaceutical drugs bills have not been paid. And even the interest subsidy given to elderly people for their savings had not been paid. These were the outstanding payments that he had to honor. Because if we have to revive the economy one by one, you first settle these claims. So he has paid, government has paid these claims, and Treasury now claims the balance sheet reasonably better because they have honored these things. President also inherited a system where State enterprises were subject to severe criticism, not performing well. Sri Lankan airline was not a story that people talk today.
Yes.
Controversially, 5 years Sri Lankan airline, they couldn't privatize, they couldn't restructure, but the airline was just basically getting from bad to worse. Many enterprises were like that. Interest rates were very high, tax rates were very high, and exchange rate was very unstable. So basically, he inherited the unstable regime, unstable economic regime. Then there was also a country, 2015, country had debt to GDP, generally measured the total debt in proportion to GDP, decline was something like 70%. It increased to almost 90% by 2019, almost 90%. This is the economic picture. It is not a blame against one party to another party, because any person, any leader, even to that matter, any CEO, you start from where you take your stocks and start from that position and see how best situation will be changed. Country was basically a victim of drug trade. Over 1 million people are used to drugs. Country was actually becoming a hub for international drug trafficking. Country was under security risk. So these were the kind of situation that people have seen. More than people, that is why people wanted something different than these. People want liberation from influence of drugs, liberation from this uncertainty, risk, violence, crime, all those stuff. So it's a total socio-economic picture that people thought President Rajapaksa can paint differently. So in my view, and what I know, is that he has addressed many of these things which has overshadowed by COVID-19, because maybe after 1 month, world saw a new pandemic in a global scale. I haven't seen, I'm old enough to see 70 years of life in the world economy. I have traveled in many places, I have lived here. We thought tsunami is a disaster. We thought oil price hike was a disaster, because oil prices during President Mahinda Rajapaksa's time was almost $110 a barrel. We thought that's a crisis. But we never thought world will ever be locked down, closed. And President Gotabaya Rajapaksa inherited that. Not that global environment was good. Actually, technically speaking, previous 5 years globally, the best period. Sri Lanka had the best period. Global business was booming, economies were growing well, oil prices were something like $35, $40. I have never managed 30, 40 oil price. International support was there. Despite all these things, country didn't see a difference. So one by one, President has addressed these things, and I'm very, very proud actually, because I was privileged to serve the President, and therefore I'm an eyewitness to see probably the one and only for certain matters, to see how well he has managed certain matters, his commitment, his understanding, capacity to take well-informed decisions, the ability to use information, data, research, not to get carried away with one aspect of a problem, and consultative approach he conducted, and through that how even Sri Lanka is an exceptionally well-managed country when it comes to COVID-19. In fact, Germany has declared Sri Lanka is the only South Asian country safe to travel. It's a recognition that COVID has managed well. Otherwise, they won't allow their people to visit here. So that's what the picture. So when people say he hasn't done anything, he has done many.
You spoke about him as a technocrat and then as an administrator, as somebody who oversaw military mechanism, war operations. Budget 2020 also we talk about foreign direct investments, and the President spoke saying that we prefer foreign direct investments over going into loans as a nation. But have we set up enough in the country to welcome and attract these foreign direct investments?
If one read this budget seriously, this budget addresses many challenges, roadblocks that prevent investment. Investment is coming from three sources. One is public sector, that is government, private sector, and foreign sector. This country's investment predominantly came from the private sector local. That's fair, because I don't think this country had foreign direct investment more than 2% of GDP any single year. We haven't crossed that threshold. We had foreign investment, but very small compared to other countries. We never had good scale of foreign investment, maybe one transaction or two transactions per year. So BOI has not attracted any big foreign investment. There has not been large foreign investment last 5 years, other than the sale of Hambantota Port, which is not an investment, it's a ownership transfer. For that company, it may be an investment, but it's not a new investment for Sri Lanka. It's the same old port. So when you think these things, we need to look at how do you create investment climate in the country. That is why when you ask, you haven't, in the budget, you don't see new revenue measures. Revenue come from where? Revenue either must come from employment, tax revenue, or must come from profit, or must from rent income or interest income. So these economic activities have to grow first, because if you have no job, you don't pay your tax on your salaries. If you have no savings in the bank, you don't pay tax on interest. So therefore, you have to create an enabling environment to get the economy bounce back. After all, the revenue we get is from the existing base, whether this economy grow or not. Treasury Secretary has reported to Parliament 70% of 2020 revenue has been realized, which means those revenue anyway will happen. What you need is a new economy, and new economy to generate new revenue sources. So that's what the taxation reform has done. It's a bold move. I don't think any leader will ever think reducing VAT from 15% to 8%, because it's too much of a shock. 0.5%, 1%, 2%, you feel comfortable, okay, just politically also good, we reduce VAT by 1%. That is the announcement impact only. But here bold decision, technically half VAT, and giving up all other taxes, which he thought is nuisance taxes, because people only pay VAT in one desk, NBT in another desk, some other tax in another desk. So it's a multiplicity of taxes that has distorted the whole economic operation. Interest rates were so high, double digit, and no investment can be realized, no factory can put into a practice, not even a mortgage bond could be realized. So interest rate high. So he managed to bring down to interest rate also to quite a low level in recent time. Now coming on to the investment, what he has said is, if a country is heavily indebted, and that critically indebted sector is government, should government borrow further? Should government borrow further, or ask our lenders to don't lend us, invest here? He has never mentioned in the budget no borrowings, no foreign projects here. What he has said is, we have different priorities. Agriculture must come first. That's President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's vision. He's telling education and health, that is our human resource base. This is a small country with a small population. Our best resource is human resources. We have to project our talents, skills, professions, and global resource base here. Our economy should depend on that kind of skill-based business, technologies having new generation. So that those are the thinking process here. And he has said, look, if I borrow from Japan, China, India, one after the other on mega projects, those projects will be there. But we are also not only accumulating those long-term projects, you are accumulating also debt. You are accumulating debt to those countries. So what he said was, this is fine. You have a commitment to Sri Lanka because you are lending to Sri Lanka, because that means Sri Lanka is viable. No, otherwise nobody lend. No. If you can't recover, you don't lend. So these countries are lending. So instead, President requested for those people, please come and invest. That's why so many projects have been selected for those lenders, because no loan agreement has been cancelled. Even the famous LRT, where Japanese had a commitment, we had a dialogue with them, because in the next 4 years, people are looking much more bigger transformation in the country. Farmers have to get their produce to the global market. Food security must come into the place. Agriculture should be beyond tea and rice. It should produce much more. Sri Lanka should at least start producing many, many diverse agricultural produce, livestock, fisheries. All these products must come in, and export should get diversified. You know, what are the requirements to get a much more diversified, well-managed risk profile in the country, and how do we get the growth momentum coming back? So it is, in nutshell, it's a very reform-oriented, Sri Lankan-centric, people-centric, inclusive development strategy that is reflected in the budget, where development partners have been requested, now come on board, invest where investment is feasible, lend where lending is possible. But please remember, Sri Lanka is deeply committed to honor its debt obligation to the global markets, and Sri Lanka will definitely bring down its debt to GDP back to 70% by 2025, when he basically tell the people, look, I have done my job, kind of a target.
When you say investments and how we can bring our debt to GDP, I thought I'd like to speak to an entrepreneur, an investor who can shed some light as to how Sri Lanka is perceived internationally. So I've invited Sri Lankan-born American entrepreneur who has invested in over 200 technology startups, including Instagram, Square, LinkedIn and WhatsApp, to name a few. Insaf Mohideen, a warm welcome. You're joining us at Hyde Park, and we're in conversation with Dr. P.B. Jayasundera.
Thanks for having me on board. Good morning, Dr. Jayasundera.
Good morning.
Good morning to you too, Insaf. I'm sure it's quite late there in California.
Yeah, it's evening.
Right. So to start off with, now the president of Sri Lanka yesterday spoke of the need to change Sri Lanka's economic model from a debt-reliant one to one of an investment-oriented one. Now, this is what we have been discussing with Dr. Jayasundera. But first, to ask you, you have been investing heavily in startups, tech-based companies, and there is a lot of investment thought that you are putting into these areas. We're talking about a lot of emerging markets too. But how do you look at Sri Lanka's investment climate now, especially with the challenges we face in COVID-19? And of course, the budget, which is perceived as something that has not given much, so to say.
So, I mean, when you look at the global economy and then relate it back to Sri Lanka, obviously none of these problems are inherent, at least this year, to Sri Lanka. So if you look at the pandemic, what it's done, it's really, really dampened global appetite for FDI. So any investments that are going on is very local because those are the investments that you can touch, feel, understand. Now, Sri Lanka in particular, I mean, we had this conversation about a year ago. Sri Lanka in particular has some challenges that it needs to overcome. One is, like Dr. Jayasundera mentioned, over the 5 years that the global economy thrived, Sri Lanka struggled. It packed on a ton of debt. We actually took on a ton of political instability and very mixed messaging to the global markets, to global institutions that were lending. So that definitely dampened the FDI environment as well as appetite from investors like us. But historically, that's an area after Latin America and emerging markets that a lot of investors like myself, whether it be tech, whether it be the services industry that we were in Sri Lanka for, primarily because there are inherent factors that make it very attractive, i.e. language skill sets, the fact that we have historically had peaceful transition of democratic power, i.e. Stable democratic government. We have good governance in place, and for the most part, fairly highly regarded in the international world when it comes to financial transactions, etc. Given that background and backdrop, certainly I think 2020 is not a good reflection of FDI or FDI sentiment for Sri Lanka, primarily because a lot of the small economies definitely have struggled a lot more, the ones especially that depend on exports. But when I look at this budget, like you said, in the definitely there is nothing mind-boggling, but yet it's very fundamental in how the president, how Dr. Jayasundera as the secretary, individuals like former central bank governor Nimad Cabral, who as a minister, they've all basically come back and rallied to basically get the fundamentals, the foundations in place, right? You have to basically be able to make sure investors have a certain level, a semblance of confidence that is on track, that we will meet our debt obligations, and more so that it is a investor-friendly environment versus a loan-friendly environment. Over the past 8 years, Sri Lanka has basically grown a reputation that, hey, it's predominantly a loan-based, high infrastructure, high development, massive projects, right? But when you look at a lot of the FDI, you have to be able to accommodate mid-sized investments, 50 million upwards, whether it be in your infrastructure, whether it be in REITs, whether it be in the technology segment, agricultural innovation. So I see a lot of those provisions in the current budget. That is definitely very endearing in terms of tax shelters, in terms of reinvestment shelters, in terms of making it taking a lot of the platforms digital to enable you to cut through technocracy, etc. So definitely, I think I didn't expect much more than this, just given the current year, the fact that the parliament was deadlocked and we have a fresh set of governance in place.
But very quickly, you'll put your money here in Sri Lanka?
I'm definitely looking at it. So I am in the process of setting up a private office in Colombo at this point, putting together a team. But definitely, like most investors, I would definitely need to be on the ground post-pandemic. I'm hoping that that can happen sometime in January, February. But very interested in a lot of the place, especially even what the port city has to offer in terms of financial governance and investments.
Right. Dr. Jayasundera, moving on to speak a little about what Insaf said too, about governance and the kind of the setup in the country, conducive environment for investment. What are we doing here to achieve that?
Well, we are, as I tried to explain, one is critical building blocks that are required to shift from loan-friendly public investment to investment-friendly public investment. One issue is the tax regime, a predictable, stable tax regime taxes which are conducive for investment and growth. Because if you ask any investor who is looking at emerging markets, they enjoy a huge set of tax incentives. They look at financial sector vibrancy, and therefore financial sector predictability, stability, another. Then several legal frameworks that for this budget many people haven't picked up, and President yesterday even addressed the Superior Court honorable judges, explaining the importance of modernizing Sri Lanka's legal system, and the budget has committed fair amount of resources, not for physical infrastructure, but soft infrastructure like legal reform, contract enforcement, contract laws, law delays in the country, 5 years, 10 years kind of law delays. Now uncertainties, dispute settlement mechanism, arbitration mechanism, those are the things investors are looking at. Then critical infrastructure, port city, and the port related port services are areas where new investment opportunities are being talked of. In the 80s, 90s, people were basically looking at small economic zones like Sita or Horana or things like that. But today people are looking much more sophisticated location for investment, and port city was conceptualized on that basis. And the new legislation is almost ready and it will be placed before Parliament. It has been referred in the budget. And that's then only people see, just because there's a land, people won't come. People look at the legal infrastructure, people look at the administrative infrastructure, people look at the capacity of the government to make decisions, people look at how investor risks are overlooked. For somebody to move from one place to another is basically a risk comparison. Investment is essentially a comparison of risk. How Sri Lanka is made a safe place to live, safe place to have COVID type of pandemic environment safe for them. How insurance business will look at these people. How, because no insurance company will issue insurance unless the place is safe. So all these need to be put in place, and port city is another area where we have put priorities. Hambantota port is another big area where transshipment businesses could develop. Port itself, Colombo port itself, which is now ranked around 11 in international transshipment businesses, to bring to a single digit high ranking port to create business environment, custom regime, tax departments, and many government agencies which will be transformed into a more online kind of tax systems, and incentive structure, and above all, country to shift to a high-tech economy. And that's why President himself has taken that responsibility, because he thinks that is the area where country has to move very fast. And in the budget, he has proposed to set up 5 techno parks. And techno park is another wave of investment where investors, IT, software, that sort of new industries where new generation of Sri Lankan are looking for jobs in those activities. Nobody is looking at the low paid workforce. Our workforce is educated. All the people are in the education system. Language advantage is there, so they are going in that direction. So it's essentially a 5 techno park, and I'm sure all 5 parks will be ready to operate by first half of next year. So investor is just have to do the due diligence, enabling environment in place, tax policy regimes are in place, stable financial infrastructure is in place, and investment risk are less, and And this is one area investment is expected in a rapid way. And also, when it's easy for people to talk technology, and the technology is having investments, but the fact of the matter is people must have access to technology. Many places in Sri Lanka still do not have high-tech access. So in this budget, if you read, the whole countries will be having the broader access, every village. In fact, every village should be, every citizen in the country should be able to have a smartphone to move on to the technological service delivery mechanism. So that is another one. Financial sector, particularly finance companies in this country, is another area where reforms have been identified in the budget. Some finance companies are not doing well.
Right.
In fact, we have experience of 2-3 finance companies collapsing during the last 5 years. Depositors have lost confidence. So therefore, you have to restore that confidence. There are also areas that has been identified, like take plantation companies, 20 plantation companies, I think managing over quite a large acreage of land, but hasn't got diversified, has been 30 years in the private sector management, but haven't seen it struggling even to come to 1,000 rupees salary level. So in that context, all these reforms have been identified. I think given the current situations, making inclusive development after all to see poverty is less, if not eradicated, and employment is recreated, tourism put back on track, and when the world is recovering from the COVID pandemic impact, people don't want 2020. In fact, when I speak to many people, they said, 2020 didn't exist, because except China, every country experienced negative growth. Travel trade is basically 70% dead. So 2020 now people are talking new normals. And Sri Lanka is one such country, has a much advanced preparation for new normalcy. And in that background, I think investment climate is much better, of course much more desired. Investment climate is also not only a question of all these put in place on paper, all these things being seen on the ground, then only confidence will build up. And I'm sure people will see that kind of a confidence building and the transformation with what is offered through the budget.
Talking about confidence, Dr. Jayasundera, I thought I'll turn to INSAF again. Confidence, Fitch ratings, this is something I want your response to also. The INSAF, I think we can still connect with INSAF. What I'm trying to ask you is about Fitch ratings, the recent downgrade that we spoke of, we heard of. We see that international rating agencies have looked at Sri Lanka, downgraded Sri Lanka. Moody's earlier, and now Fitch. They talk about certain mismatches, they talk about certain lagging areas. But how does it seem, what do you see as an investor when rating agencies globally, they talk about negative approaches?
Any investors, especially institutional investors, when they look at investments into a country, obviously recent downgrade doesn't play well. But at the same time, I think as we've gone through the 2000 era of irrational exuberance, etc., we've experienced that these rating agencies don't necessarily get it right every single time. So, for instance, if you look at it in 2011. American credit rating was downgraded, right, by Standard & Poor's. Yet, if you look at 2011 to 2020, the U.S. has had one of the most phenomenal economics, going from Dow Jones going from 8,000 to 30,000. So in a lot of instances, there isn't a direct correlation to the downgrades, but the downgrades are based off of the foreign reserves and your ability to meet debt obligations. So the fact that Sri Lanka has not approached IMF or other institutions for strengthening their foreign reserves, they see as a concern. So that's one of the factors. So you never want a debt default happening on any government's hand at that point. Definitely that's a kiss of death for foreign direct investment. Yet at the same time, looking at a lot of the rebuttals that have been put forth and a lot of the liquidity policies that are being put forth to collect internal funds, I don't see that as a big issue. So another thing that, to keep in mind with these credit rating agencies is, as of June 30th, 33 countries were downgraded, 40 countries were put on negative outlook. And out of those 40, 18 have now been downgraded. So essentially half the countries they're monitoring have been either downgraded or a negative outlook been given. So in that backdrop, another thing to consider is, the biggest argument is foreign reserves. So now IMF specifically has established the rapid lending facility and the backup lending facility, very specific to pandemic lending. And unlike previous, lending terms where it would take 3 to 4 to 6 months to negotiate, places like Ecuador, Peru, Chile, they were able to get credit lines within a matter of a week. So worst case scenario, you try to basically pay off some of these debts and not take on draconian IMF measures, run the country, and worst case, you have, you are able to go back and raise funds from these guys within a matter of a week or so to be able to meet your debt obligation. So I don't necessarily see it as a big issue, but institutional investors certainly will worry about it and shy away from it. So that's where, in terms of Sri Lanka's strategy to pull in FDI, they have to become a little more non-traditional. They can't be going to the traditional lenders, etc., as has been seen with the bond sales, right? We're not quite attracting the same stature of sales. We're not getting the oversubscriptions that we used to get. So definitely a new approach needs to come through in terms of attracting investments. And I think some reflected already in our budget, right, in terms of some non-traditional approaches to raising liquidity.
Dr. Jayasundera, about Fitch ratings, how do you respond
to this? Yeah, I think he has responded quite well, because
as government, is it? Speaking on behalf of the government rather than an investor, is it?
That is an investor perspective. Rating agency ratings matters not very much to the government, it matters to the investors. Now see how they look at, because for many Sri Lankan, this is the only headline. But I know the rating was done even almost simultaneously with the budget, haven't with much deep analysis on the budget, number one. Number two, I'm wondering which country got upgrading from rating agencies in last 3-4 months, because he himself quoted 40 countries, 50 countries, either rating has not been revised, another 40 or 50 countries have been downgraded. So it happens. So because they are looking few things. And more than commenting, because the government itself has responded, the Honorable State Minister of State Enterprises, former governor, who knows quite well how rating agencies work and how to address them, has given explanation. So therefore I do not want to spend more time on that, but I just want to say one thing. If Sri Lanka is looking a conventional solution and live in comfort zone, you just talk to IMF, get a rapid financing facility and claim that you have reserves, and life goes on. Or, as President Gotabaya Rajapaksa explained in his own vision, I want to do something different. I want to do something Sri Lankan. I want to model this country on a steady growth path, not just because if, I don't know whether you are aware, from 1977 till the last IMF program, this country has been on 17 IMF programs. 17 IMF program. What have we got? So, country need to think a development model, sustainable development model, and innovative development model to to fulfill the aspiration of the nation's objectives. So it is in that context we are looking at these policies, and I think investment climate is much better, I can tell you with my experience, and also with confidence, because after all, rating agencies are not accountable if something goes wrong. I am personally accountable. And I have seen, because when the going is good, nobody is there, there will be many. But when the going is bad, 1 or 2% will have to be accountable. And I am absolutely confident what the policy designs engineered by President Rajapaksa is the right way and a bold way of transforming the country.
You say you're accountable. Is that why you take arbitrary decisions? They say you're very rigid. You don't listen to many. That all these decisions are yours and only yours.
Listening does not mean going all over the places and do this. My whole career, I have been in a dialogue process. We talk to private sector, but we also take decisions. That is how decision makers make decisions. Decision can't be, because even if it is a collective decision, somebody is responsible. So that is how decisions are taken. People must have courage to make decisions. People must have knowledge to make decisions. People must also take certain things on a correct path. So it's a conscious, and people must be honest also to take such decisions.
Do you work very well with your officials? Do you
work
listen to them?
Of course, they have to feed. Otherwise, I mean, if I can do all this by myself, right? And then you don't need anybody, because here I'm not a technology man, I'm not a capital market man. So the capital market proposals have come from the SEC and the Colombo Stock Exchange people who spent 1 year in formulating how to get the capital market. Technology sector, there's a separate group working in the technology. It's their proposals that have been reflected. There's an education reform presidential task force. It is their proposals that have come into the budget. There is a whole range of consultation with the agricultural sector. It is those ministries' proposals that have reflected it. Sports, another big area in the shifting from child development to sport economy, is a proposal coming from the sports ministry. And so this is a collective contribution to form the budget. All what I have done is to assemble these things in a consistent macro framework where the government objectives are reflected. So we are technocrats. It's a technocrafting of the policy guidelines we received, and I have worked with Prime Minister quite well. Prime Minister, the one who asked me to do it. It is Prime Minister who talked to people and trade unions and various people and eventually make a political decision. And economy is basically, economic policy framework is basically put in. It is not just a number game. It is also a clear policy and policy issues. And I have done that, so that is how I make my decisions. But of course I must say, I take decisions. And I take decisions and I take the full responsibility of them.
These international agencies, too, governments, some may believe that Sri Lanka should work in a more balanced, should have a balanced approach, or should have dialogue, especially when we talk about the European Union. They've warned us against the GSP Plus, especially with import restrictions. Do you stand by Sri Lanka's decision to restrict imports? Plus, about our response in dealing with the European Union, because if we lose this concession to our exports, can we withstand the repercussions?
Sri Lanka, what is reported and what is discussed are two different things. Again, probably media like to see the GSPs withdrawn and trade restrictions come. You look at I think 2 weeks ago, Asia Pacific region was formed. India, not India, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, several countries, 10 countries formed a new Asia Pacific region. 1 week after, China slashed 200% duties on Australian imports to China. Countries have to manage this situation within certain things. We haven't stopped imports. Let's be very clear. But some big ticket items like motor vehicles, we have stopped. Because if the choice is between importation of motor vehicles by spending $1,500 million per year or honor your debt obligation instead, I advise government to first honor the debt obligation, because these debt investments, the investment in sovereign bonds, also have been made by the Europeans. Do they like to see debt default or motor vehicle import getting suspended for a year? When we discuss this with our counterparts, they appreciate this. They appreciate these situations. So what they want is, we haven't stopped imports of raw material. Take apparel industry, which technically collapsed by March because of the lockdown in 2020, bounced back, virtually bounced back, and our exports are now back in the same levels that we used to perform before COVID situations. And how do we export? Do we have textile here? We import textile, we import consumable, we import various other requirements for the processing of exports. And these things are happening. Countries' trade is taking place, except some big ticket item like motor vehicle imports or gold imports and things like that. So country has not stopped imports. Country has, because some countries you can't import also, because not only we have locked down, we have locked down the trade. But those countries.
But can we, Secretary, deal with any repercussions if these countries go into any strict measures?
No, if many countries have to, if trade is not an instrument to use as a leverage to gain something, it is to develop a bilateral relationship. Now, I myself had a discussion with this German ambassador. He didn't mention to me anything about any trade restrictions, any withdrawal of concessions, because they are also turning to countries like us, because our countries have many positives that they can speak of. And we have trade with Germany, and he was very pleased when I explained we are unable to permit the importation of motor vehicles, but the medical drugs, pharmaceutical equipment, advanced technology, the tourism, and a whole lot of issues, plus spare parts and things like that, which can come in. In fact, German ambassador was very pleased to see that we are encouraging health sector investment. And so GSP is not just, I remember GSP issue was there even in earlier,
right,
even previous governments. But I don't think we should just stick to one issue when there are so many other positive things are happening.
අපේ සිංහල අංශය වෙනුවෙන් සිංහල භාෂාවෙන් ප්‍රශ්න කීපයක් අහන්න කැමතියි. මේ ආනයනය සීමා කිරීම ගැන කතා කරපු නිසා මම හිතුවා මේ ප්‍රශ්නේ මෙතනදී අහන්න ඕනේ කියලා. වාහන ආනයනය සීමා කිරීම නිසා ජනතාව කලකිරීමෙන්ද ඉන්නේ. මොකද අලුත් වාහනයක් පදින්න ආසයි මේ එතකොට ඒ වගේම අපේ ආනයන කරුවන් this is their bread and butter. එතකොට ඒගොල්ලන්ටත් මේ ඉන්කම් එක රෙස්ට්‍රික්ට් වෙලා තිනවා. එතකොට ඒ ඉකොනොමි එකත් අපි දුවන්න ඕනේ. ඒත් එක්කම මේ සමහර වෙලාවට හිතනවා මේ ආනයන සීමාව කිරීමට ගියේ අපේ රට ඇතුලේ කිසිම ප්ලෑන් එකක් නැතුව කියලා. දැන් කහ ඉම්පෝට් කරන්න ඇයි අපි මෙහෙ වගා කරන්නේ නැතුව මේකට ගියේ? කරලා ඉවරලා නෙමෙයිද මේකට යන්න ඕනේ කියලා.
මේක අර බිත්තරේද කුකුලද කියන ප්‍රශ්නේ අහන්නේ. වගා කරලා නවත්තනවද නවත්තලා වගා කරනවද කියන choice එකක් තියෙන්නේ. එතකොට ගොවියන්ගේ පැත්තෙන් ඇහුවොත් ගොවිතැන් කරන කෙනෙකුගෙන් ඇහුවොත් මේ වගා කර තරඟකාරී ලෙස ගෙන්නන්න ගියොත් ගොවියන්ට සාධාරණ මිලක් ගන්න බැරි නිසා ගොවියන් කියන්නේ අපිට වගා කර හැකි නිෂ්පාදන කහ මාස 6ක් ඉඳ කහ වගා කිරීමට සැලසුම් කරලා කහ වලට මිලක් දීලා උඳු වලට මිලක් දීලා බීලු උණු වලට මිලක් දීලා අල වලට මිලක් දීලා හාල් වලට මිලක් දීලා අපි නිෂ්පාදන ආර්ථිකයකට යනවද නැත්නම් අපි අපේ රටේ විදේශ විනිමයක් නැහැ. හරි මොකද කාර් එකේ ඉඳන් කහ ටික ගේන තැන දක්වා රටේ විදේශ විනිමය කොහෙන්ද ඕන සංචාරක කර්මාන්තයෙන් එහෙම නැත්නම් ඒ විදේශ විනිමය අපිට රටවල ගිහිල්ලා වැඩ කරලා එහෙම නැත්නම් ඒ විදේශ විනිමය ඇඟලුම් කර්මාන්තේ වැඩ කරලා එහෙම නැත්නම් තේ කර්මාන්තේ ඒ ටික තමයි තියෙන්නේ. ඒ විදේශ විනිමය හොයලා කහින් ගුරු සියමලා වල ඉඳන් පිට රටින් ගේන ආර්ථිකයක් අපි කරන්න ඕනේ. එහෙම නැත්නම් මේ ඊටාම කෙටි කාලය තුළ වගා කර ඇති නිෂ්පාදන ක්ෂේත්‍ර වලට ප්‍රවේශ වෙලා වගා කරනවාද කියන ප්‍රශ්නයක් තමයි තියෙන්නේ. ඒ උඩ තමයි ජනාධිපතිතුමා ප්‍රතිපත්තියක් වශයෙන්ම ගත්තේ මේ කුෂිකාර්මික නිෂ්පාදන. දැන් උදාහරණයකට ගන්න. මුං ඇට වවන්න කොච්චරම කාලෙද යන්නේ වවනවා මාස 2යි. මාස 2යි මුං ඇට වවන්න. උඳු වවන්න කොච්චරද කල් යන්නේ. එතකොට මේක මේ කොළඹ වරායට නැවක් ආවා කියලා ඒක ක්‍රියා කිරීමෙන් නිෂ්පාදන ආර්ථිකයක් හදන්න බෑ. එතකොට නිෂ්පාදන ආර්ථිකයක් හදන්න ඒ නිෂ්පාදන ක්ෂේත්‍රවල නියලන අයගේ ආර්ථික ආරක්ෂණය දුන්නොත් තමයි දැන් අර ඉන්වෙස්ටර්ස්ලා බදු තානිල්ලනවා වගේ තමයි අර කතා කරපු කැපිටල් මාකට් එකේ ආයෝජනයට අවශ්‍ය විශ්වාසය වගේ තමයි ගොවියෙකුත් මේ විශ්වාසය තුළ තමයි ගොවිතැනට බහින්නේ. නිෂ්පාදනය කර නැත්නම් එයාටත් මේක කරන්න අවශ්‍යතාවය නැහැ. මේ හැම එකක්ම නිෂ්පාදන ක්‍රියාවලියක් පිටේ එයත් කරන්නේ ඉන්වෙස්ට්මන්ට් එකක් මාස 3ක කැපිටල් මාකට් එකට ස්ටාර්ට්අප් කැපිටල් දානවා වගේ තමයි ගොවියෙකුත් තමන්ගේ කුඹුරට ගිහිල්ලා ඒක සකස් කරලා නිෂ්පාදනය කරන්නේ. මේක එක ක්ෂේත්‍රයට අවමන එකක්. ඊළඟට අහන ප්‍රශ්නය තමයි රථ වාහන ප්‍රශ්නය. හැබැයි ලංකාවේ ඔය මොටර රථ වාහන නතර කිරිල්ල සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ මේ රජෙම නෙමෙයි. IMF එක තිබුණානේ 2016 ඉඳන් 2019 වෙනකම් EFF ප්‍රෝග්‍රෑම් එක තිබුණා. එතකොට ඒ IMF වැඩසටහනේ යටතේ මෝටර රථ ආනයනය සඳහා 200%ක ඩිපොසිට් මාජින් එකක් තියලා තමයි වාහන පාලනය කරලා තිබුණේ. රත්තරන් ගෙන්වීම නතර කරලා තිබුණෙත් ඒ වැඩසටහන් යටතේ. මේවා මේ IMF එකනුත් කරපු යට. එතකොට එහෙම තිබිලත් 2019 වෙනකොට ලංකාවේ වාහනයනය කරුවන් ළඟ තිබිච්ච වාහන ප්‍රමාණය මෝටර් බයිසිකල් මෝටර් කාර් ඒ සියල්ල අවුරුදු 2කමාරකට රටේ අවශ්‍යතාවයට තියෙන වාහන. එතකොට රටේ අවශ්‍යතාවයට වාහනක් තියෙනවා නම් ඒ වාහන ගෙන්නන පුද්ගලයන් ගාව විදේශ විනිමයක් නැත්තම් බැංකු වලට ණය ගෙවන්නෙත් නැත්තම් රටට විදේශ විනිමයක් නැත්තම් මේ කළමනාකරණය රට ලොක්ඩවුන් වෙලා නම් ඒක ඒ තොග ක්‍රිය වෙනකම් වාහන වගේ දෙයක් සීමා කර ගැනීම රටේ උන්නතිය වෙනුවෙන් ගත්ත ඉතා හොඳ තීරණයක් හැටියට තමයි මම දකින්නේ. පමණක් නෙමෙයි එහෙම තමයි රටවල් ට්‍රාන්ස්ෆෝම් වෙන්නේ. මොකද මේ ලංකාවට උඟ දෙන්නේ නැතුව ඇති සාමාන්‍ය තත්ත්වයට තේ වාහන ගෙන්නුනා ඩොලර් මිලියන 1500ක අපිට ස්වෛරී බැඳුම් කරවලට අවුරුද්දකට ගෙවන්න තියෙන ඩොලර් මිලියන 2යි. ඩොලර් බිලියන 2යි ගෙවන්න තියෙන කියන්නේ වාහන වලින් මේවා කරපු ඉතින් මේක රටේ විනිමය කළමනාකරණය, රටේ අයවැය කළමනාකරණය, රටේ බැංකු කළමනාකරණය කියන්නේ මේ මුදල් සම්පත් ඉතුරුම් සහ ආයෝජන කොයි ආකාරයටද කළමනාකරණය කරන්නේ කියන එක. ඒ කළමනාකරණය කිරීමේදී අපේ රටට පුළුවන් වෙළඳ ප්‍රජාවක් හැටියටත් කරන්න බැංකුවකට ගියා. ඔය ආකාර එකක් ගන්නවා කියන්නේ වගේ ලෝන් එක බැංකුවට ගියා වගේ LC එකක් ඇරිය කාර් එකක් ගන්නවා. ඔය විදේශ විනිමය නැහැ. ඊට පස්සේ හැබැයි වගේ පරිභෝජන විදේශ විනිමය කාර් එක විදේශ විනිමයෙන් ඒකට ගන්න තෙල් විදේශ විනිමයෙන් ඒකේ නඩත්තුව විදේශ විනිමයෙන් ඔයාගේ ඩ්‍රයිවිං විතරයි දේශීය. දැන් එහෙම ආර්ථිකයක් අපිට නිෂ්පාදනය කළ නොහැකි දේවල් තියෙනවා. ඒ අවශ්‍ය අපිට නිෂ්පාදනය කළ නොහැකි තාක්ෂණය. අපි තමට ඒ ඇඩ්වාන්ස් රිසර්ච් වගේ වට අපි කාලේ ගත කරන්නකට වැඩිය ඒවා කරපු අය ඉන්නවා. හැබැයි අනික් දේවල් අපේ රටත් අද තාක්ෂණය පාවිච්චි කරන නම් කෘෂිකර්මයේ පළදාව වෙනස් කරන්න පුළුවන්, නිෂ්පාදන තබා ගන්න පුළුවන්, වෙළඳපොළට යන්න පුළුවන්. දැන් මේ කොවිඩ් කාලය තුල වුණත් අපේ රටේ මස්, බිත්තර, මාළු, එළවලු, පළතුරු අපනයනය කරන්න පටන් ගත්තේ. ඒ පටන් ගත්තේ මොකද මේ නිෂ්පාදන අවස්ථාව හදලා දුන්නොත් දේශීය නිෂ්පාදකයන්ට ශක්තියක් තියෙනවා. ඒ නිෂ්පාදන ඉදිරිපත් වෙන්න. ඉතින් ඒකයි ඔකේ යථාර්ථය හැටියට මම දකින්නේ.
ලේකම්තුමනි, එතකොට දැන් කොරෝනා සමග ජීවත් වෙනවා වගේම තමයි COVID-19 කොරෝනා වෛරස් මේ තත්ත්වයෙන් එහා ගිය ආර්ථිකයක් ගැන අපි කතා වෙනවා. එතකොට ඒත් එක්ක මේ ජාත්‍යන්තරේ තරහ කරගෙන යන්න පුළුවන්ද? එතකොට
ජාත්‍යන්තරේ කිසිම තරහ කරගැනීම නැහැ. හරියට දැක්කොත් ඒත් හදන මතයක් නේ. ජනාධිපති ගෝඨාභය රාජපක්ෂ ජනාධිපතිතුමාගේ විදේශ විනිමය පළවෙනි දවසේ මේ තුමා ප්‍රකාශ කළේ පාර්ලිමේන්තුවට ප්‍රකාශ කරේ එතුමාගේ විදේශ ප්‍රතිපත්තිය නියුට්‍රල්. නොබැඳී ස්වාධීන ප්‍රතිපත්තියක නේ. අයික රටක් මේ රටක් නෑ. එතුමා ජනාධිපති වුණාට පස්සේ ඇමරිකාවේ විදේශ ලේකමුත් ලංකාවට ආවා. චීනයේ විදේශ ඇමතුමත් ලංකාවට ආවා. එතකොට ඉන්දියාවේ විදේශ ඇමතිවරු රාජ්‍ය නායකයෝ ලංකාවට ආවා.
හැබැයි රටක් හැටියට අපිට ලොකු ප්‍රෙෂර් එකක් නැද්ද මේ ඔක්කොගෙම ඌමනාවන් වලට කන් දෙන එක? ඒ
රටවල ලොකු ප්‍රෙෂර් එකක් ඇති අපේ. ඇයි ඒක පැත්තකින් ඒ රටෙන් අපිට ප්‍රෙෂර් එකක් එන්නේ අපේ රටේ වැදගත්කම නිසානේ. නැත්තම් ප්‍රෙෂර් එකක් කියන්නේ බිල්ලා ආක්‍රමණය කරන්න එන්න ප්‍රෙෂර් එකක් ලැබෙන්නේ මේ තියෙන්නේ. එතකොට අපේ රටේ ඒ රට ප්‍රෙෂර් එකක් නැද්ද? දැන් අපි ප්‍රෙෂර් එකක් නැද්ද? එහෙම ප්‍රෙෂර් එකට ජපානයේ අපිට නෙගෝෂিয়েට් කරන්න බැරි නම් ඒ ප්‍රෙෂර් එකට LRT එක ගෙනියනවාද? එහෙම නැත්තම් ඇමරිකාවේ ප්‍රෙෂර් එකට MCC එක ගෙනියනවාද? එහෙම නැත්තම් යුරෝපයේ ප්‍රෙෂර් එකට GSP ප්‍රෙෂර් එකට මේක කරනවාද? එහෙම නැත්තම් අපේ පැත්තේ කතාවත් ඒ රටත් එක්ක සාධන උදාහරණයකට අයවැයම කියනවා අපේ රට ඉන්දියාවටයි චීනෙටයි ජපානෙටයි විතරක් වෙළඳපළක් වෙලා තියෙනවා ඩොලර් මිලියන 9000ක්. ඒ කියන්නේ ඒගොල්ලන් අපිට එක්ස්පෝර්ට් කරන්නේ. දැන් අපි හිතන්නේ අපි මේ ප්‍රෙෂර් එකට එතකොට ඉම්පෝර්ට් කරනවාද? නෑ, අපේ ප්‍රතිපත්තිය වර්ධනය නිසා අපි ඉම්පෝර්ට් කරන්නේ. මොකද චීනය, ජපානය, ඉන්දියාව වගේ රටවල් ඒ රටවල වල නිෂ්පාදන ආර්ථිකයක් හදන්න උත්සාහ කරන. ඉතින් එතකොට දැන් තරහ කර ගන්නවා නම් ඔය අලුම රටවල් තුන්ටනේ ඔය කියලා තියෙන්නේ.
ඔව්, ඒත් එක්ක මට අහන්න ඕන දෙයක් තමයි මේ ජාත්‍යන්තර ශ්‍රේණිගත කිරීමේ ආයතන ගැන. මම හිතන්නේ අපේ මේ සිංහල භාෂාවෙන් කතා කරන හින්දා අපේ ජනතාවටත් මේ ගැන පොඩ්ඩක් පැහැදිලි කරලා දෙන්න පුළුවන්. මේ සුපුරුදු පරිදි ඉංග්‍රීසි භාෂාවෙන් මගේ ප්‍රෝග්‍රෑම් එක කරගෙන යන්න ඉස්සෙල්ලා මේ දැන් අපි ක්‍රිබ් එකට ගියත් ඉන්ඩිවිජුවල්ස්ලා හැටියට අපි පොඩ්ඩක් ඩිෆෝල්ට් වුණාම මේ අපි පුළුවන් තරම් බැංකුවත් එක්ක ගනුදෙනු කරගෙන අපි මේ ඒක निराකරණය කරගන්න හදනවා. හැබැයි මෙතනදී අපි දකිනවා අපේ රට දැන් ෆිච් එක මොනා කරත් අපි කෙලින් වගේ මේ අපි ගණන් ගන්න නෑ වගේ.
නෑ, අපේ රට ශ්‍රේණිගත කිරීමක් කරද්දී හරි ඔයාගත්ත ක්‍රිබ් එක ගන්න. ක්‍රිබ් එක කියන එක ඔයා කරනවාද? ඔයයි ක්‍රිබ් එකයි දෙන්න ණය ගෙවීමේ හැකියාවයි ණය අය කරගැනීමේ හැකියාවයි කියන යථාර්ථය තුළ මේ ක්‍රියාවලිය මේ මොනවද කියන එක ග්‍රිප් එක ඔයා කරන්නේ. නැත්තම් ග්‍රිප් එක දැන් ඔයාගේ මේ බැංකුවෙන් ග්‍රිප් එකට අපි 8ක් ගාලා ගිහිල්ලා සෝල් කරගන්න එක නෑ. ග්‍රිප් එක හදලා තියෙන්නේ මේ ගනුදෙනු කරුවයි බැංකු කරුවයි අතර ඉතා ධනාත්මක ගනුදෙනුවක් ඇති කරගන්න. එහෙම නැත්තම් ග්‍රිප් එකට නම දැම්ම බැංකුවෙන් ඔයා අයින් කරනවා. ඒ ක්‍රියාවලිය එහෙම ගියොත් වෙන්නේ බැංකුවට ගනුදෙනු කරක් නැති වෙන එකත් නේ. එතකොට බැංකුවට හිමි වෙන්නේ ලෝන් එක මේ තියෙන ඇපේ උකක් තියලා ඩෙට් රිකවරි ඇක්ෂන් එකක් ගන්න එක විතරයි. ණය අය කරගන්න ආයතනයක් වෙන එක විතරයි. හැබැයි බැංකුවක් බලන්නේ ගනුදෙනු කරුවයි බැංකු කරුවයි අතර කොහොමද වඩා ලාභදායී ලෙස මේ දෙකම පවතින. මොකද බැංකු කරුවට ගනුදෙනු කරුවා නැතුවත් පවතින්න බෑ. ගනුදෙනු කරුවන්ට බැංකු කාර්යය නැතුව පවතින්න බෑ. උදාහරණයකට කොවිඩ් එක වෙලාවේ කාටවත් ණය ගන්න බෑ. ඉතින් මේ මිනිස්සු ඇවිල්ලා කිව්වා හරි මේව අරගෙන යන්න බැංකුවට ගිහලා මේ වින්දේසි කරලා අය කරගන්න. දැන් ටුවරිස්ට් හෝටල් වල ණය අය කරගන්න ක්‍රමයක් නැහැනේ. ටුවරිස්ට් හෝටලේ අරගෙන බැංකුවට දුවන්නත් බෑනේ. එතකොට මේ එහෙම විශේෂ අවස්ථා තියෙනවා. එතකොට මේ ශ්‍රේණිගත කරන ආයතනත් මේ රටේ කරන වැඩ පිළිවෙල පරීක්ෂා කරලා බලලා ඒ ශ්‍රේණිගත කිරීම නිවැරදි අවස්ථාවට මේ අවස්ථාවේ ආර්ථිකය නෙගටිව් වුණා. ආර්ථිකයේ අවස්ථා ගොඩක් නැත්තම් ශ්‍රේණිගත කරන දර්ශකයේ අනුව සමහරට මේ ඒගොල්ලන්ට කියන්න වෙන්න පුළුවන් ශ්‍රේණිය. හැබැයි ওই ශ්‍රේණිගත කරන ආයතනෙම ලබන අවුරුද්දේ මේ වෙලාවේ ශ්‍රේණිගත කරනකොට ධනාත්මකව දෙන්නේ නැද්ද කියලා මම ඔයගෙන් අහන්න කැමතියි.
මේත් එක්ක මම හිතනවා මේ සිංහල භාෂාවෙන් කතා කරන හින්දා මේ අපි ඉන්සාෆ් වෙත යමු වුණොත් හොඳයි කියලා. Insaf, if you don't mind maybe responding to one last question in Sinhala, I thought I'd ask you මේ දකින විදියට අපි දැන් කතා කරා ජාත්‍යන්තර මේ ණය ශ්‍රේණිගත කිරීමේ ආයතන ගැන. එතකොට ඔබ දකින විදියට විදේශ ආයෝජන අපේ ලංකාවට ආකර්ෂණය කර ගැනීමට අපේ සුදුසු පරිසරයක් අපි හදාගෙන තියෙනවද මේ විදියට මේ කතා කරන උණු ජාත්‍යන්තරේ කතා වෙන්නේ ඩවුන්ග්‍රේඩ් එකක් ගැන?
දැන් කොරෝනා නිසා ඉඳි ලෝකෙම ෆොරන් ඉන්වෙස්ට්මන්ට් අඩු වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. ලොකු ප්‍රශ්නයක් තියෙන්නේ කියන්නේ මිනිස්සුන්ට කොයිවත් යන්න බෑ. රටවල් යන්න බෑ, ගිහිල්ලා ඉන්ස්පෙක්ට් කරන්න බෑ. ඒ හින්දා උගක්ම businesses capital expenditure spend කරන්නේ, hire කරන්නේ, අලුත් investments මොකුත් දාන්නේ නැහැ. හැබැයි කොරෝනාට පස්සේ මේ foreign investment අලුත් අවස්ථාවක් ගොඩාක් open වෙයි. මම හිතන අනුවට. එතකොට ලොකු demand එකක් ඇති වෙයි. ඒක ඇති වුණාම investors ඉන්නවා, high risk investors ඉන්නවා, low risk investors ඉන්නවා. high risk investors සාමාන්‍යයෙන් downgrade වුණ රටවල් වල ඇවිල්ලා invest කරන risk එක නිසා ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ investment policies නිසා ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ governance නීති රීති නිසා. හැබැයි දැන් technological investors අපේ වගේ investors බැලුවොත් දැන් downgrades වලට පස්සේ අපි ගිහලා invest කරන එතන තමයි highest risk highest reward තියෙන්නේ නේ. දැන් BRIC countries වල බ්‍රසීල්, රෂ්යා, ඉන්දියා, චයිනා 2009 හරියට risks තිබ්බා, හරියට downgrades තිබ්බා. හැබැයි එතන තමයි අපි ගිහලා invest කරේ. ඒ කියන්නේ වැඩියෙන්ම concessions ලැබුණේ මේ වගේ රටවල් වලින්. ඒකට ලංකාව ගැන හිතනකොට ඉතා හොඳ සුදුසු පරිසරයක් ඇති. ඒ කියන්නේ මේ ප්‍රශ්න තිබ්බට ස්ථාවර රාජ්‍යයක් තියෙනවා. අපේ tax rate එක අඩු බදු අනුපාතයක් තියෙනවා. salary scale එක හොඳයි. ඉන්දියාව වගේ බැලුවොත් දැන් salary scale එක හරි ගන්න. මොනා කරන්න බැලුවොත් හරි. අනිත් එක මේ export potential එක අපනයන අවස්ථාව තියෙනවා. We are a massive export country, right? Employee skills තියෙනවා. අනිත් එක මේ transportation infrastructure facilities, logistics ඒ ඔක්කොමද මේ stability එක තියෙනවා. ඒ නිසා මම හිතන්නේ මේ foreign direct investment data on the climate data, high risk foreign direct investments.
Right. Very quickly, before I let you go, Insaf, about China, India, and the Secretary spoke about the country's aim to shift to a tech-based economy to spur economic growth led by tech investments. So I know you're very interested in this. You have invested in a lot of startups, tech-based ones. How do you think we should move forward? Again, looking from a foreign investor perspective, what do we need here?
So obviously, I mean, when you look at foreign investments coming from any of these countries, you're going to have a tug of war, right? Essentially, in the US right now, leading up to the entire elections, you had a huge issue with TikTok. Where there was, huge intellectual capital issues and, trade wars. So that's something you always want to watch out for when you're getting into technological investments, because it's no longer localized, right? That's one of the advantages of tech investments and services investments is it's very plausible to start a company out of Sri Lanka with Sri Lankan talent with foreign investment that could be the next billion-dollar investment. And that can be very easily replicated if the right governance, the right tax play and stability is there. So for instance, if you look at places like Dublin, Ireland had no technological play back in the late 2009, 2010. They actually put together a very comprehensive package of tax reform, very comprehensive package of concessions, infrastructure build, as well as basically, building tech cities, which is something that Sri Lanka is trying to do now. Dubai has done that successfully. So we would need to see, beyond the words, we would need to basically see some level of infrastructure investment, some level of accommodation for this, right? So I see investments in vocational training. I do see investments being made in technological training. We're talking, the Secretary talked about the tech cities. But Sri Lanka has talked about tech cities for a while. We haven't seen that development. So that's particularly what we would like to see is from a services technological investment perspective. One is a safe environment to be able to bring in the dollars or whatnot and invest it. Then basically full government backing stability. And additionally, to make sure that you're not caught in between these trade wars between China, India, the US, right? There has a certain level of protection that's extended because you don't want to build a technology or a business that's now subject to your trade sanctions.
Thank you, Insaf. We had with us Insaf Mohideen, Sri Lankan-born American investor joining us. He has invested in several startups, technology-based startups in the United States. So thank you for joining us and for sharing your comments. So getting back to our conversation once again, Secretary, we speak about GDP growth. Now, most of the time we try to measure economic development, growth rate, but we see that even the first quarter growth was released and we're in the negative, and then the second quarter was expected to be released by the 15th of September, but it was indicated by the Census and Statistics Department that we will be receiving these results by the 15th of December. But why the delay? Is this a question of, some may wonder whether there is going to be some sort of manipulation of data here to fit the agenda of the government?
No, as far as I'm concerned, statistics is an independent agency. It is they who should release the data. For me, whatever the GDP figure they say doesn't make much of a difference. I know first quarter was not very good because we all knew the world was getting
-1.6% for Sri Lanka. Okay.
World was getting, because I was explaining to you, growth was declining over a 5-year period and spilling onto 2020. So I don't think President Gotabaya Rajapaksa can just reverse on 19th of November that downturn. So it takes time. Second thing is, second quarter, even if Census and Statistics Department come up with a positive growth, to me it doesn't make sense. Whether negative or not, because country was locked down. So what do you expect? Then we come to the third quarter. And third quarter was election. And country was basically slowly getting back to back out of lockdown environment. And only thing is the exports that declined to $300 million per month in March with the global interruption, bounced back by July, August to the $1 billion level. So certain sectors have recovered. Tourism still remains bad. To me, when I go around this place, if I see more cranes, that's GDP to me. If the cranes are stuck and no construction site at work, even if GDP is 5%, doesn't make sense to me. Activities must take place. Activities must generate growth. I know agriculture is active because every week I go to my village, I see farmers are well engaged. Farmers haven't stopped because fish rating has downgraded. Farmers haven't stopped because census and statistics has not released its growth numbers. They must be also struggling, by the way. I can see their difficulty because the country is in a migration from trade-dependent economy to a production-dependent economy, on a conventional economy to a technology economy. We also, during the 3-month lockdown period, online service delivery, online services, distance education. How do you capture this in the GDP now? Methodology has to change, because if anybody think you can compute the GDP in 2020 same way that you did the GDP in 2019, I think that itself is a reflection. We don't read 2020 well.
Where do you expect us to settle at the end of the year?
I think, you know, the people with the economic activities come back. When people see new methodologies are required, numbers will come. For example, if usual procedure is if we take import and export, based on those numbers, you can work out the production figures. For example, take we export 95% of our tea. So if from the export figure one can read the GDP figure. Suppose if we stop exporting bulk tea and instead produce value-added tea, how do you measure GDP? So these are methodological issues. We must let the scientists and the researchers and the statisticians to come. To me, what is on the ground matters.
We speak about exports, the kind of difficulties that not just, at least the bigger players are surviving, but we're talking about SMEs, the engine of growth. We speak about tourism industry, a lot of informal sector there too, and exports where you're trying to promote exports, but there are difficulties in moving ahead. What is the strategy here, Dr. Jayasundera, to bring all these segments of our economy together where we can rebuild, especially to stand up from this ongoing crisis?
Now you are speaking. Now you are speaking, because we need a well-integrated strategy linking micro and macro sectors quite well. Now, on the GDP itself, IMF World Economic Outlook, which they release every 6 months, IMF has projected the growth rate for Sri Lanka, among several others. IMF projected -4%. Now IMF has projected this growth rate from Washington. Now we still haven't got the growth rate, while on the ground. Rating agencies did the rating online, not on the ground, because they are unable to travel. Asian Development Bank has projected -7% growth. So each one has its own judgment about how various sectors are read. We in Sri Lanka look at financial inclusiveness. 70% of our economy doesn't have access to finance. They either go to microfinance agencies or micro-insurance agencies or informal market sources, and the banking system unable to pass the benefits to those people. We saw it when the COVID came and when people asked relief, when people asked debt moratorium and various things, big corporate sector, organized sector, it's not big corporate sector, organized sector was able to get the benefit. They replaced their expensive debt from the low-cost funds. They managed to get the full benefits of rescheduling, etc., etc. But the ordinary people, if you take the bus operators, three-wheeler operators, school van operators, and small shops, boutiques, and restaurants and things like that, tourism, in many of those places, which who are also an important part of the supply chain, were unable to get the full benefits. And those were assisted either by government giving 5,000 rupee cash grant or a Samurdhi releasing money for Samurdhi beneficiaries. So there is insufficient financial inclusiveness in the systems, and that is what the government is looking at development bank options. Sri Lanka's banking systems are deposit accepting lending agencies. We don't have investment banks. We don't have development banks. We all have commercial banks which accept deposits, keep the required reserves in the central bank, lend the balance, make provisioning nicely according to the ISFI standards and central bank regulations. Banks are good. After all, no bank has run at a loss either. They declare good profits. They declare good dividend to shareholders. From where do they generate this profit? That's the issue.
What happens to the number of jobs that were cut, the people who were left redundant?
But
How is the government going to look at that?
No, that's why government has to revive the real economy. To get the tourism, we have two options. Take tourism as one example where everybody in the country now knows what the cost benefit of tourism. Lockdown and virtual non-arrival of tourists to Sri Lanka basically not only affected the investors who have put their money on hotel industry and related businesses, but the employees who have been working in this sector directly and indirectly, nearly 2 million. Nearly 2 million people are displaced because at least 90% are not at work. So now two options. One is to find an alternative sector for these people to work. Right? Or revive the tourism. We revive the tourism. Short term, no hope of revival, no, because until the tourists start traveling, and for tourists to start traveling, airline had to restart their operation. 75% of the travel trade is standstill right now. No. I mean, if you speak to the major airlines traveling to Colombo, how many are coming? They are not coming because they are not permitted to travel. So most of their planes are grounded. Some are only operating cargo. So in an environment like this, that's why some countries don't regard these restrictions seriously and gradually opening, because this is not a sustainable way of moving forward. So so-called new normal is, now tell me, now you do research, you speak to the people, what is new normal? To live with COVID. Live with COVID is new normal, so you take your precaution. But there is no way, even if you get a virus vaccine, that means you are living with it. So that's the new normal, and then probably you have to have pre-travel quarantine, post-travel quarantine, then like that.
A lot of quarantine.
A lot of quarantine, more than business. But then quarantine itself may be a business. Because, somebody has to stay because if you are traveling, you have to stay in a hotel for 7 days or 10 days quarantine. So the hotel industry, tourism industry may find new ways of keeping 14 days somebody inside the room happily.
Dr. Jayasundera, we have 2 minutes more on the show.
Okay.
So finally, people look forward to, they want to hear from you what we can do, what we cannot do, where we can go and where we cannot, what we cannot achieve. You're quite straightforward with what we can and cannot. So I'd like to end the program on that note.
No, what we can, and I mean, somebody can say we can do everything, right?
But we cannot.
Not that we cannot, we have to decide what is first.
Priorities. And
prioritizing, sequencing, and go gradually. My view is, the president has got his priority list right. His priority list right, and now in hindsight, I feel he knew even to prepare for COVID. That is why he put agriculture first, because this country is agricultural country, not only in terms of production, it is the residential place for many people who are even in the cities. So agriculture has to come first, food security, environmental security, then exports, then engagement of people and elevating them from poverty. Putting effort in the agriculture is a worthwhile activity which he has recognized. Then Sri Lanka is a middle income country. Despite everybody think we have a poor rating, we have no prospects, but Sri Lanka is a middle income country and they are looking for middle income living aspiration. That's so urban development, urban lifestyle issues have to be next issue. Country need to shift to exports and produce viable imports locally instead of importing. So shifting from trade to production is a priority, and then country shifting from loans to investment are things country can do, and all those things have been put in the budget, and therefore budget can be what we can.
The words of Sri Lanka's most senior public servant, if I may say?
Senior post in the public service.
Somebody who has worked closely with presidents, prime ministers. I think somebody who is one of the most senior public servants who has had the opportunity to work so closely with many presidents and prime ministers, overseeing Sri Lanka's transformations, challenges, developments over these years. So thank you very much, Dr. Jayasundera, for your time. It was indeed an honor to have you.
Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. We had with us Dr. P.B. Jayasundera, Secretary to the President, and you were joining us at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24.